Hello, this is a 6th grade review for the lesson 3, the muscular system. So I'm just going to go through just some of the highlights from the chapter, and I am going to be, if you want to write it down on these pages, make sure you have it written down in your spiral. Those are pages 40 and 41 if you want to write this down. So the first thing is that the muscular system, there are 3 types of muscle. We've got skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. Now, the first thing, first of all, there's over 640 muscles in your body. They work in groups. The smallest muscle is actually found in your inner ear. The largest muscle is what connects your pelvic girdle to the largest bone, your femur. That's actually called your gluteus maximus. It's your bum. And then the strongest muscle, not ironically because it's God, but the strongest muscle happens to be your masseter. It's what keeps your mouth closed. And scripture references so often how it's important for us to be quiet and just listen. So he's instructing us to exercise this muscle and keep it closed and keep that mouth closed so that we can hear what's being said and not get ourselves or into trouble or hurt other people's feelings. Now, muscles are meant to pull, not push. Muscles do not push. They work together to pull and then relax and pull and relax and pull. So they're working together for movement. The skeletal muscles are. They contract and pull, but nothing ever pushes. Skeletal muscles are attached to bones by what we call tendons. And our skeletal muscles are voluntary. I can tell my muscle to do that. I can think I need to raise my hands. That's a muscle movement that I'm using. The bones aren't moving by themselves. The muscles are what's moving the bones. Now, there is what's called a partial contraction. When you contract and it pulls it up, there's what's called partial contraction, and that actually is what equals your muscle tone. So when you say that somebody has good muscle tone, like they're very strong, their muscles are very defined, their muscles are almost always semi-contracted, versus somebody who has no muscle tone, they're very loose, they're not very strong, there's no definition in the muscles, there is very low muscle tone. Now, tendons, how these muscles are attaching to the bone. Tendons, our strongest tendon is the Achilles, which happens to be the back of your ankle, that really strong tendon that goes from your heel up to the back of your leg. And there's a really cool story in your book you need to read. It's on page 58 about how we got the name Achilles tendon. But your Achilles tendon is the strongest tendon in your body. Now, there are 2 types of things that are working together. There's what's called an extension, which opens the joint, and flexor, which closes the joint. So if this is a joint, we learned in the skeletal system chapter, this bone and these bones connected to each other, that space is a joint. So what closes the joint would be an extension, and what opens the joint would be a flexor. So this movement is happening from pairs of muscles working together. Your bicep and your tricep, they're working together. And when pairs of muscles work together, that's called antagonistic muscles. So antagonistic muscles work together, contracting, relaxing, and it is what is opening and closing our joints. Now, the less you use your muscles, obviously the weaker they are, but that is called atrophy. When a muscle has atrophy, it means that it's getting smaller because it's not being used. So what are muscles made out of? Well, muscle cells, because remember everything starts off as a cell, cell, tissue, organ system, cell, tissue, organ system. Right now we are talking about muscle tissue. The muscular system is muscle tissue. So these cells of muscle tissue are made of long, thin, they're called fibers, long, thin fibers with lots of nucleus. So when there's multiple nucleus, it's called nuclei. And those have these strands of proteins called I want to make sure I say it right, myofibrils. But I want to double check. Yes, myofibrils. So These fibers have strands called myofibrils within them, and inside the myofibrils are filaments. So filaments form together to make myofibrils, which forms together to make a fiber, and lots of fibers makes this tissue, makes this muscle tissue. Now the filaments, depending on their size, are different colors. And those cause what looks like stripes inside the muscle. We call those stripes striations. So that's important because these three types of muscle, skeletal, smooth, and cardiac, each have a different amount of stripes, a different amount of striation within them, which means there's a different amount of filaments within them. Now, all of these fibers are bound together with connective tissue, and the end of that, they're bound together in connective tissue, and that connective tissue is what forms the tendon, which connects to the bone. So that's how the muscle is actually attached to the bone. Now, inside your muscle, inside this muscle tissue, there's blood vessels, and that is how your blood is moving around your body. Your body breaks food down into glucose, which is the fuel for the cells for this muscle growth and repair and movement and all of the things that needs to happen. Your blood is carrying the glucose to the muscles inside the vessels. And then it also carries waste out because every process needs fuel and creates waste. So your blood vessels are actually what is carrying the fuel to and the waste out of everything. Now, what controls it all? What tells your muscles to contract and relax? What tells your muscles to do this? It's all controlled by nerves. We're going to talk a lot more about the nerves when we get into the nervous system, but it's all controlled by nerves. Now, your brain is the control center of everything, and the nerves travel from your brain to the rest of your body down your spinal cord, down your actual, not the bone part, but what's inside the bone. Your spinal column is the bones, the vertebrae. Inside, that's protecting what's inside of it, which is your spinal cord. That's a bundle of nerves. If that gets broken and one of those nerves gets severed or injured, everything below that isn't getting the messages anymore, which is how paralyzing happens. So if there's an injury, the muscle itself isn't broken. It's the brain sending the message to the muscle to work is what's not getting there anymore. The message isn't getting it there anymore. So being paralyzed is not damage to the muscle, that is damage to the spinal cord, to the messages. When you have an actual muscle injury, that's different. Now, facial expressions, that is because you have a lot of muscles in your face. And humans are one of the only ones that have the ability to do that. So animals can't make facial expressions, not nearly as many as humans can. That's because we have so many muscles in our face. Now, the muscles in our face are actually not connected to your cranium. They're not connected to your brain. To your skull. But they do work in such a way and in pairs and in groups to be able to create all of that movement. Now, contractions, your muscles would get really tired if they were all doing every job all the time. So God actually designed our muscular system, our muscles, to take turns with their contractions so they don't get so tired. And all of this is happening, remember, at the cellular level. Everything is happening within the mitochondria. So muscle tissue cells, muscle cells that makes muscle tissue, has a lot of mitochondria. And I remind you, the mitochondria is the powerhouse. It's the engine. It's what's making everything work. Well, if there's a lot of work that needs to get done, it's going to need a little bit more engine. So there's a lot of mitochondria in muscle cells. There's two vocab words that your book talks about in pages 61 to 64. Anaerobic and aerobic. When the mitochondria is doing its job, it requires oxygen and glucose and all of these things to happen. It requires oxygen. Well, anaerobic means the process happens without oxygen. Aerobic means it happens with oxygen. And that's very important. We're not going to see those words just here in the muscular system. We're going to see them in a lot of different areas as you go through, even all the way through high school science. you're gonna need to know that anaerobic means without oxygen and aerobic means with oxygen. Now, when this process happens in an aerobic process with oxygen, there is a waste product that happens, and that's called lactic acid. Lactic acid is what makes your muscles hurt when you're working out. It builds up in your body, and your body's not removing that waste fast enough. So if you were to do 10 push-ups, not a big deal. 100 push-ups, your muscles are hurting, and they're gonna hurt for days and days and days and days and days. That is a build-up of lactic acid at the cellular level. It's a waste product of aerobic energy. So when your body is using aerobic energy with oxygen, it creates this waste of lactic acid. That's also what makes you huff and puff, right? When you're tired, you're breathing heavy because you need oxygen to get rid of the lactic acid. So you need oxygen, you're breathing more in. That's literally why you're breathing heavier when you're doing aerobic activity. Now that makes sense. So the last part, page 64 to 66, the last part of our chapter. Muscles don't change. The number of muscles don't change. When you get stronger and your muscles get bigger, that doesn't mean that they have more muscles in them. It just means that the muscle they had got bigger. Now, that happens by growing the myofibrils, which we talked about a little while ago. So the fibers are full of proteins called myofibrils. Proteins of myofibrils. When you have more proteins and they get bigger, and that's what makes your muscles bigger. Now, the more you use it, the more growth there is. The less you use it, the smaller it gets. There's no growth. And remember, we talked about atrophy. So that means that it gets significantly smaller. The last thing I want to mention is the cardiac muscle. That literally means heart. Your muscle is made out of its own type. Your heart is made out of its own type of muscle called cardiac muscle. It is what's called involuntary, which means you don't have to tell it what to do. Your heart is doing its job on its own. You don't have to think, oh, pump, 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 contract. You're not telling it to do that. It's doing it on its own. There's another set of involuntary muscles. Your smooth muscles are involuntary as well, and that makes up things like your digestive system, so like your intestines and your stomach, your bladder. Those, you don't have to tell your body, digest my food, squeeze my food out of my waste out of my body. You don't have to tell your body to do any of that. It does it on its own. That's because it is an involuntary muscle. It is smooth muscle. Now, smooth muscle has no striations. Remember those stripes out of the filaments that we talked about? The smooth muscle has no striations. Your book has a really good picture of the difference of the three types of muscle. So smooth right here. So there is skeletal muscle with all of the stripes, cardiac muscle with less striation, and smooth muscle with no striation. So your muscles, there's those three kinds. Skeletal muscles makes you move, it's connected to your bones. Cardiac muscle is your heart, and it is involuntary. And then your smooth muscle, also involuntary, has way less striations. And again, involuntary just means that you're not telling the muscle what to do. So that is the muscular system in a nutshell, just a quick overview. You do need to exercise all of your muscles. So that includes your heart muscle. You need to exercise your cardiac muscle to make it stronger. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. Bye.